So good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the Track B Women's Suffrage in Washington State session. My name is Crystal Rogers. I'm the processing archivist for the Labor Archives of Washington at the University of Washington Libraries in Seattle, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Washington occupies the land of the Coast Salish peoples, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. If you'd like to search for the tribal land that your current location occupies, you can do so by going to native-land.ca. And I can pop that link in the chat, or if somebody else has that handy, you can look up what Indigenous land your location occupies as well. Just a Zoom tech reminder to make sure that you are muted when you're not speaking. This will help limit background noise and distraction during the presentations today. And then we'll be holding questions for all the panelists until the very end. We've got about 10-15 minutes reserved for Q&A. So feel free to pop your questions in the chat throughout. I'll be keeping tabs on that, and we'll present those questions to panelists during the Q&A time at the end. And finally, just a reminder, we are recording today's session. If you would not like to appear in the recording, you can turn your video off throughout this morning's session. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters in the order in which you'll hear from them today, and also on the slide here. Our first presenter is Kate Dugdale. Kate is a lifelong Seattle resident and works as the Education and Interpretation Coordinator at the National Nordic Museum. She will be giving a presentation entitled, "Not Exactly a Success Story, Washington's Unique Suffrage History," telling the tumultuous story of women's suffrage in Washington between 1883 and 1888, including what sets Washington's suffrage struggle apart from elsewhere in the United States. Our second presenter is Trish Hackett Nicola. Trish is a certified genealogist, public historian, and retired librarian. She has worked with the Chinese Exclusion Act files at the National Archives as a volunteer since 2001. Trish has published numerous articles and given many presentations on various aspects of the Chinese Exclusion Act files. She has a blog at ChineseExclusionFiles.com and will be giving her presentation today, World War I and World War II, War Brides and Citizenship in the Pacific Northwest. This will discuss the legal challenges, barriers, trials, triumphs, support, and assimilation of women who came in the Pacific Northwest as foreign war brides after World War I and World War II. Our final presenter is Joan Burton. Joan was born in Seattle, where she discovered mountains and mountaineering when she was a girl. As a teenager, she took a climbing course and was climbing major peaks in Washington by the time she was 15. She graduated from Whitman College and taught high school English for 3 years before retiring to have 3 children. She raised them, returned to teaching, and then to work at the University of Washington. Burton authored Best Hikes with Children in 1988 and Urban Walks in 2001, and continues to write and tell stories about Northwest mountaineering women. Her presentation, Women Acting Together to Save a Forest, discusses the creative and courageous women who led the way for today's conservation activities, including the efforts of Ella Higginson, the first woman poet laureate of the state of Washington, and Catherine Montgomery, a professor who fought for women's suffrage. Really excited for the programming today. I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over to Kate to kick us off. And I will be timing you, and I'll pop in 2 minutes before the 25-minute mark to let you know time's almost up.
That sounds good. Thank you, Crystal. And thank you everyone for being here today. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Good morning. It's lovely to be with you today. I'm going to be telling the story of women's suffrage in Washington Territory up until 1889 with the State Constitutional Convention. And as you can tell from the title, it's a little bit complicated. So the story of Washington Territory suffrage spans the entire territorial period starting in 1854. Right after Washington Territory was formed, at the first meeting of the territorial legislature, Arthur Denny proposed a bill to enact women's suffrage. This first motion almost passed, ending up at 9-9, and it's speculated that Denny proposed this bill on the advice of Catherine Blaine, who you can see in the image on the left. Blaine had participated in the women's suffrage movement on the East Coast in the 1840s before traveling to the Washington Territory and staying at Arthur Denny's house as the territory was being formed. Blaine was also one of the original signers of the Declaration of Sentiments that came out of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. So it's possible that her involvement in the suffrage movement back east is what inspired Arthur Denny's bill. It's also worth noting that some historians speculate that Denny's bill did not pass because it limited suffrage to white women in the territory, who did not make up much of the female population at that time. At least one of the original members of the 1854 legislature who voted against suffrage had an Indigenous wife who would not have benefited from Denny's bill. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, women kept the suffrage struggle relevant through publicized attempts at voting. And one of the best known examples of this was in 1869, when Mary Olie Brown attempted to vote in Thurston County. And you can see an image of Mary Olie Brown right there on the right. Brown's attempt to vote drew a wide crowd, but as she reached the polling station, she was informed that she, as a woman, was, quote, not an American citizen, hence not entitled to vote. Brown defended herself as a citizen and allegedly convinced many in the audience that day that women already had the legal right to vote under the 14th Amendment, but ultimately she was unable to vote that day. However, in southern Thurston County, Brown's sister, Charlotte Olie French, was able to vote that day. And an interesting story from the historical record claims that Charlotte French and 6 other women were able to vote because they purposely put the election judges into a good mood by providing them with a delicious picnic. Their plan clearly worked, and the 7 women voted without any protests. The next big moment for women's suffrage in Washington Territory came in 1871, when Susan B. Anthony visited and spoke to the territorial legislature. She toured this area with Abigail Scott Dunaway, an important leader in the Pacific Northwest suffrage struggle. I'll talk more about Abigail Scott Dunaway a little bit later on. During her tour, Anthony made over 30 speeches and traveled over 1,000 miles. Her visit was important for revitalizing the movement in the territory, and she inspired Dunaway to become a lecturer for women's suffrage herself. Anthony's arguments promised that suffrage would inspire women to move to the male-dominated Pacific Northwest, which the territory would have welcomed. By having more women, Anthony argued that Western society would become a more moral place. As we'll see later on, this argument was fairly effective, but the reality of having women voting to moralize Washington turned out to not be very popular in practice. 10 years later, in 1881, the territorial legislature almost passed full women's suffrage, showing that the issue was gaining ground. The rights of married women were expanded in this year, and all women were allowed to vote in school elections, again showing that suffrage activists were making progress. Just 2 years later, suffragists finally got the big prize. In November of 1883, the territorial legislature passed the Act to amend Section 3050, Chapter 238 of the Code of Washington, which allowed women over the age of 21 to vote in all territorial elections. The signing of the bill was a fanfare event, as Dunaway and other women presented Territorial Governor Newell with a golden pen to sign the bill, quote, presented to him for the purpose by women whom he had thus made free. Okay, so now women have the vote, and we can move on to this period from 1883 to 1888, where women can vote more or less that whole time. And this is where the story starts to get really complicated. In this 5-year period, women gain and lose the right to vote twice. The first major test for women's suffrage was if women would even come out to vote at all. Newspapers at the time alleged that women from society would not register to vote, claiming that, quote, women as a body would not be very eager to avail themselves of their new privileges. And this opinion turned out to be very wrong. In Seattle, the Post-Intelligencer reported that more than 300 women registered to vote in the 1884 municipal elections, and that in terms of voter turnout, women outnumbered men in many places across the entire territory. Women who participated in these elections had a good experience, despite the initial fears that polling places would be inappropriate for women. One, Cornelia Jenner, wrote that her voting station was fairly proper and that she, quote, only heard 3 oaths, none of them very blasphemous. The next major test for women's suffrage came in 1886 with the local option vote. In the 1880s, the railroad industry in Washington expanded the economy and attracted a largely male workforce to Seattle. And Seattle and other urban areas became pretty rough, with crime and corruption becoming real issues. One argument that women had used to try and get the vote all over the country was that female morality, virtue, and purity would help tame what many perceived to be a vice-ridden urban environment. In this time period, women were thought to have a calming influence on the rough male society, and suffragists used that to their advantage to get the vote. So one particular issue was the local option vote. Local option would allow cities and towns to enforce prohibition of alcohol without making it a territory-wide issue. Prohibition or temperance had been a women's issue for a long time, which makes a lot of sense. In this time period, women who were abused by and financially dependent on drunk husbands had no way to leave that situation. And banning alcohol was seen as many as a way to protect those women. As such, the Washington chapter of the powerful national anti-alcohol organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, officially stated that they would only vote for candidates that supported prohibition, effectively becoming single-issue voters. Despite this position from the WCTU, local option was defeated, but even the potential that prohibition could become the law of the land made women voters not as popular. Newspapers would later claim that temperance and the local option vote was the beginning of the end for women's suffrage in the territory. In 1887, just 1 year later, one Jeff Harland was convicted of gambling, and he challenged his verdict as his jury consisted of both men and women, and Harland claimed that women were not his peers under the law. The higher court in the territory found in Harland's favor. The court went further and decided that according to the founding document of Washington Territory, the Organic Act of 1853, the law giving women the vote was invalid. The court opinion stated that every law should embrace one subject, and that subject should be in the title, meaning that you should be able to know what a law is about just by reading the title of the law. And the law that gave women the vote originally was the well-named Act to Amend Section 3050, Chapter 238 of the Code of Washington. The amendment had simply removed the word male from that named section, giving all citizens the right to vote regardless of sex. But because the title of that act did not explicitly say it was relating to suffrage and voting, it was declared unconstitutional, and women lost the vote. The next legislature in the fall of 1887 created an act to enact women's suffrage that was properly titled. It's worth noting that this fast-acting legislature would have been elected by both male and female voters. The new bill was then sent to Territorial Governor Eugene Semple to sign in January of 1888. This is Eugene Semple here on this slide. As he was making the decision whether or not to sign, he received several letters from citizens all over the territory that expressed the multiple changing perspectives that people held about suffrage. Most of the letters were written by businessmen who claimed that suffrage was not popular in their immediate business communities. In their opinion, women's votes contributed to an economic depression in the territory in 1884, and they argued that the business community across the territory was against giving women the right to vote again. One C.B. Hopkins of Colfax wrote that pro-suffrage activities in his community did not express the sentiments of the majority of the community, particularly the business portion. G.H. Wheeler, a fervent Tacoma Democrat, wrote to Semple explaining that he had spoken with 100 businessmen in Tacoma and that only one had spoken support of suffrage. Wheeler went on to say that in the past, nearly every one of that 100 had unwisely signed a suffrage petition for women, believing that petitions were ineffectual and of no force. Despite these letters, Semple did end up signing the bill, giving women the right to vote one more time. But this second victory was short-lived. The final blow to women's suffrage came in the form of Mrs. Nevada Bloomer of Spokane. Nevada and her husband owned a saloon in Spokane, and they hatched a plan with John Todd, a local liquor supplier and an election judge in the district. Mr. Bloomer and Mr. Todd decided to run a test case using Nevada's vote to see what would happen if Todd turned Nevada away when she tried to vote. And just the possibility of local option in Spokane is what inspired Todd and Bloomer, and they utilized Nevada to get rid of its threat. After Todd refused Nevada's vote, the case was eventually brought to the highest territorial court in the summer of 1888, and the court ruled against suffrage, taking voting rights away from women once again. The majority opinion this time stated that the Organic Act did not confer power upon the legislature to give women the right to vote, so suffrage was lost a second time. When this decision was handed down, people recognized that it was somewhat flawed. The judges had ruled that lawmakers that wrote the Organic Act would never have intended women to vote. So it seemed strange that women's votes were taken away based on an interpretation of what original lawmakers might have thought or intended. Newspapers like the Washington Standard, based in Olympia, claimed that the decision was based on false reasoning. And yet, suffrage was not immediately brought back just like before. Those same articles and newspapers advocated against enacting women's suffrage again. So what had changed since 1883? Why had support for suffrage lessened? There are three factors that made suffrage vulnerable and caused women to lose their right to vote just 5 years after first gaining it. One of these factors was the changing male perspective on women's suffrage. In 1883, there were many men in Washington Territory who supported women's right to vote. Clearly, a majority of men supported women's suffrage, as only men in the legislature could have given women the legal right to vote. Originally, newspaper articles indicate that men were impressed by how women turned out at the polls in 1884 and 1885, and they were amused by the novelty of women voting. Right after women got the vote, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer wrote that women were having a positive effect on the polls and that women made polling places more respectable. But just a few years later, after the courts overturned women's suffrage for the second and final time, the Post-Intelligencer practically reversed their earlier position. In an editorial, the paper stated that, quote, women's suffrage has proven a practical failure in Washington Territory, and it has accomplished nothing in the way of public or private good. Going even further, the Post-Intelligencer editorial seems to have a problem with the type of women who were actually voting, claiming that, quote, as a rule, modest and good women have not voted, at least not the second time, while vicious women and women of the coarser class have been vulgarly conspicuous at the polls. The local option vote in 1886 made many men uneasy, despite the fact that local option was defeated after women lost the vote in 1888. The Washington Standard in Olympia wrote that women had proved to be, quote, too emotional to wield political power with prudence and moderation, and that women who voted solely for temperance would eventually lead to an overregulation of the entire society. For example, women in the WCTU would vote for anti-alcohol candidates of any political party, thus throwing partisan politics out the window. And it's clear that from newspaper articles that this way that women were voting was a problem. This era in our political history was particularly partisan, so the fact that women were voting on the issues of temperance rather than party affiliation was concerning for men who worried about the status quo. Whether or not this concern really justified taking voting rights away from the female population is, of course, a very different question. Some men simply had a change of heart about suffrage that was not tied to any specific concern. In 1889, the Washington Standard published an interview with Territorial Representative Joe Kuhn of Port Townsend. Kuhn was considered one of the fathers of the 1883 suffrage bill, but by 1889, he had changed his mind. His explanation was that women's suffrage had been given a fair trial in the territory, but that it should not exist any longer. Another main reason that women's suffrage became vulnerable was because of the different perspectives within suffrage leadership. One of the main leaders of the suffrage movement in Washington Territory was Oregon resident Abigail Scott Dunaway, who you can see here in the image on the left. Dunaway was the de facto leader of the suffrage fight in the Pacific Northwest, and she was praised for her efforts by prominent national suffragists like Lucy Stone. However, she was also described as an autocratic leader, and her aggressive activism and devotion to the movement sometimes offended lawmakers in Olympia. After suffrage almost passed in 1881, some lawmakers said that if Dunaway had just been nicer to them, it would have passed easily that year. Dunaway felt that women's suffrage would emancipate women from having no financial control over their lives. This is unlike the WCTU, for whom suffrage meant that women could ban alcohol to protect themselves. The image on the right is Frances Willard, who is the WCTU president during this time period. For Dunaway, all issues relating to prohibition were tied to women's lack of financial independence. And while she supported prohibition personally, she knew that the business community in Washington opposed it. And she feared that if men could no longer drink or profit from alcohol, women would be blamed. As early as 1881, she claimed that if women attempted to, quote, close the rum shops, they would have 1,000 forces against them. Dunaway's opinion would be her downfall within the local suffrage movement. In her newspaper, The New Northwest, Dunaway advised Washington's women to vote against local option in 1886. She recognized that voting to regulate alcohol could have a negative impact on how people thought about women's votes, and she worried that suffrage was not very stable in Washington Territory, having only been enacted 3 years before at this point. She was heavily criticized for this position. The WCTU accused her of having sold out to liquor in a pamphlet that was spread throughout the country. And in Massachusetts, the Women's Christian Prohibitory League voted to publicly censure Dunaway. All of this caused the New Northwest to lose its core readership, meaning that Dunaway was not able to publicly and effectively comment on the legal challenges suffrage faced in 1887 and 1888, most importantly, the Nevada Bloomer case. Before suffrage was passed, Dunaway and the WCTU were able to work together for their common goal of giving women the vote. But once women got the vote, they started disagreeing about how women should be voting, and that glue that held the different parts of this leadership together fell apart, making suffrage vulnerable. A final reason that women's suffrage was vulnerable was the pressing issue of statehood. A lot of people did not think that Washington would be admitted as a state of the Union if women had suffrage, since women could not vote nationally. No other territory that had women's suffrage had yet been admitted as a full state. And therefore, when suffrage was defeated through legal challenges, many people were really not that concerned with bringing it back a third time, not when Washington had a real chance to become a state in 1889. The concern that Washington would not be admitted as a suffrage state was a real one. In 1883, right after Washington women got the vote, Senator Eustis of Louisiana proposed an amendment in the Senate to end women's suffrage in Washington, should they be admitted as a state. This amendment was rejected overall, but clearly the Senate was concerned about women's suffrage in a state of the Union, signaling to Washington territorial leaders that maybe they should be worried too. The push for statehood would leave women's suffrage behind. Seattle suffragist and future state legislature, Adela Parker, later claimed that women were told by their male political allies not to continue pushing for suffrage in 1888 and 1889. Parker does not name names, but she stated that suffragists in 1889 were told that, quote, if women would just trust the chivalry of men, suffrage would be incorporated into the new Constitution. This would turn out to be a case of misplaced trust. Clearly, many of the representatives involved in the Washington State Constitutional Convention were just not ready to risk statehood for the cause of women's rights. During the convention, Edward Eldridge, a delegate from Whatcom County and a devoted suffragist, moved to strike the word male from the voting rights section of the state constitution, but his motion was defeated 50-8. When suffrage was put to a direct vote at the convention, it was defeated by a margin of almost 20,000 votes, with only 4 counties supporting suffrage overall. All 3 of these factors, the loss of male support, the schism in the leadership, and the pressing issue of statehood, made suffrage vulnerable to the legal challenges it faced in 1887 and 1888. And all 3 of these factors explain why suffrage was not included in the 1889 state constitution. So, what makes Washington's suffrage story unique? This is the real question. That flip-flop between suffrage and suffrage again, and then women lose their right to vote again, is a unique story to tell. This dramatic suffrage story is unlike other states in their fight for suffrage. The ultimate failure of suffrage in 1887 and 1888 was one of the first times women who got the vote then lost it. People like to tell success stories, and suffrage in Washington was not exactly one of those. Women lost the right to vote for the next 20 years. Until 1910. The 1910 Washington suffrage victory was the first for the national movement in the 20th century, it had been 14 years since the last state had passed women's suffrage. Just 2 years later, in 1912, neighboring Oregon women won the right to vote, and Abigail Scott Dunaway was finally able to cast her first vote at the age of 78. These victories in the Pacific Northwest and across the country ultimately led to the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution, granting suffrage for American women in 1920. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was fascinating. I'm not a Washingtonian by birth, so I've only been here for 5 years and didn't know about that earlier winning suffrage and then not getting suffrage and until 1910. So really appreciate your presentation. Okay, so next we have Trish Nicola, who will be giving her presentation.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll be talking about the citizenship laws affecting women as they pertain to the war brides up to World War II. The Naturalization Act of 1790 was the first statute for U.S. citizenship. It concerned unindentured white males. Women weren't mentioned. Their citizenship was linked to their husbands. Unless single or widowed, there was no reason to naturalize. They could not vote and usually could not own property. There were court fees involved, so they didn't think it was really worth it. The U.S. was involved in World War I from 1917 to 1918. The term war brides originally referred to women who quickly married before their husbands left for the military service. By the end of World War I, the term war brides now meant international women marrying soldiers who were serving overseas. I'm going to be talking about U.S. soldiers and their war brides. With thousands of marriages, World War I was the first war with formal regulations enacted to control these relationships. They tried having a dating and marriage ban, but eventually thought it was an unavoidable consequence of war. It was a new phenomenon for the military. This is a map of Europe during World War I. Sources vary, but about 7,000 to 10,000 or as many as 20,000 US soldiers were married in Europe. US citizenship laws during the World War I era allowed foreign-born wives to become US citizens by marriage. During World War I, about 2.8 million servicemen and women served overseas. Foreign-born soldiers composed over 18% of the US Army. Almost 1 in 5 draftees was born overseas. They wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States. Congress passed legislation allowing for the expedited naturalization of foreign-born members of the military. More than 300,000 immigrant soldiers eventually became citizens, and if some of them were war brides, these women would become citizens when their soldier husband naturalized. There was a good need for guidance for the soldiers and their brides. Chaplain corps provided guidance and counseling. While awaiting honeymoon or bridal ships, non-English speaking war brides were tutored in English and schooled in the American way at bridal camps in France. These European camps, supported by the US Army, the US State Department, and even the French government, were staffed by the American Red Cross, the YMCA, and the YWCA. Sometimes military newspapers like Yank and Stars and Stripes gave advice to soldiers going through the process. There was a lot of paperwork, and they needed all the help they could get. There was quite a bit of publicity about the war brides. These photos are from a 1919 Portland newspaper showing some war brides on honeymoon ships. The brides were mostly British and French. This article from Portland newspaper tells how it was done. One day a telegram arrives at the Red Cross like this: English war bride arrived SS Louisville, will arrive Portland Monday, May 26, 8 p.m. dressed in blue hat, tan serge dress, tan shoes, carrying black leather bag, wears straw sailor hat, has blue eyes, rosy cheeks, and pleasant smile. Meet her at train and transfer her to Medford, Oregon, wiring home service there to meet her, signed American Red Cross. Or the message might end, interview family, find out if willing to receive bride, introduce her to family. That's quite a difference in the reception and could be pretty scary for the war bride. The logistics were difficult and challenging. The arrival of 7,000 to 10,000 European war brides in US ports in the early 1920s generated interest and controversy. American Red Cross described them as strong, honest, and young, with fascinating little manners, charming courtesy, who would be a real asset for America. In reality, many young US women and mothers didn't necessarily think as highly of them. There was lots of resentment. They thought these foreigners were stealing their men and leaving fewer men for them. The reality for the brides was that some were abandoned by soldier husbands or rejected by his family or community. They were homesick and many could not speak the language or understand the customs. Some were expecting lavish city homes but ended up in rural areas with no neighbors. The soldier in his handsome uniform whom they fell in love with was now just a farmer or a laborer. Sometimes the soldiers exaggerated their life in the United States, and the young brides may have had unrealistic hopes and expectations. The Cable Act, also known as the Married Women's Citizen Act of 1922, was passed. It repealed the provisions of the Expatriation Act of 1907 that had revoked the citizenship of women who married foreigners. Now she could become a citizen on her own right, and citizenship was not automatic. A woman could keep her US citizenship after marrying an alien, but she still lost it if she married an alien Asian. Women who had lost their citizenship had to petition the government to regain it. The act did create problems. For example, the laws in more than 20 countries stated that a woman's citizenship follows that of her husband's. She would lose her citizenship of her native country and be stateless unless or until she became a US citizen. This could make her life really difficult if her marriage had turned sour. There were many amendments and more complications that would take a lot more time to explain in this presentation. In World War I, there were fewer brides than in World War II. Fewer soldiers served overseas for a shorter amount of time. So now I'm going to move on to World War II. There are no consolidated records specifically for foreign-born military wives, but there's a large variety of records on the war brides. There were at least 115 to 500,000 war brides in World War II, according to immigration and naturalization figures. The higher number is probably includes the occupation years. About 75% of these brides came to the United States. The problem with these estimates is that they vary widely from one source to another. In the book War Brides of World War II by Olie and Barbara Sibetta, who were the daughters of war brides, they estimate that there were about 1 million war brides who married US soldiers between 1942 and 1952, and that 75% of them came to the United States. That's 750,000, so it's quite a difference between the other estimates. These war brides came from England, Austria, France, Germany, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and China and about 40 other countries. There are no statistics on women who married US soldiers and did not come to the United States. Transportation was a challenge. The lowest 4 grades of enlisted men were not eligible to receive government-assisted travel for their brides, and some of them needed visas. It was even harder for fiancés. There was quota. People in the United States were upset when transportation was used for wives instead of soldiers. Sorry. There were crowded conditions. Although the brides and their children were packed in together, usually there was an abundance of food. Unfortunately, several children died of measles and pneumonia on some of the ships. The Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. When it was in effect, Chinese could not become naturalized citizens. A woman lost her citizenship if she married a Chinese man who was not a citizen. After it was repealed, the annual quota for Chinese immigrants was 105 a year. It has been estimated that between 12 and 20,000 Chinese American men served in World War II. Many of them were not citizens. About 5,000 Chinese war brides came to the United States between 1945 and 1950. This is a collage of 2 Seattle Chinese families with war brides. The top photos are from Jean Chen's family. Her father was a US citizen serving in the US military in China. Her parents met, married, and had their daughter Jean in China. The 1946 photo on the left shows them on the ship coming home to the United States. They ended up in Seattle. The bottom photos are of Cheryl Leo Quinn. Cecilia met Francis Leo, a Chinese American who was stationed in Shanghai during World War II. Francis, a US soldier, was able to bring his wife, Cecilia, into the United States. Eva, a second-generation Chinese Canadian, met Edward Yip in Seattle when she came here to visit her sister. Edward was an unnaturalized Chinese serving in the US military. Canada had their own Chinese Exclusion Act from 1923 to 1947. Even though Edward was a captain in the Army, he could not bring his Chinese Canadian wife to the US. She lived without her husband and their children without their father from 1939 to 1945. This story shows you how the importance of the War Brides Act of 1945. The act was passed to allow alien spouses, natural children, and adopted children of members of the United States Armed Forces, if admissible, to enter the United States as non-quota immigrants after World War II. This is really important to Chinese war brides. It bypassed the annual quota of 105 after the act was repealed in 1943. More than 100 to 300,000 war brides from many countries entered the United States under this act and its extensions and amendments until it expired in December 1948. And these war brides had difficulties assimilating too. German and Japanese brides sometimes were considered the enemy. Like many German women who dated American men at the beginning of the post-war period, she was ostracized in her country for fraternizing. When she married and settled in the United States, she was branded a Nazi for a brief period. Asians couldn't blend in as the Europeans could. Many felt isolated and homesick. They struggled with language, culture, and even humor. Brides of African American soldiers had no idea of the racism they would be dealing with interracial marriages were banned in the states until 1967, in many states until 1967. It caused overwhelming problems for the war brides. Women here complained that the war brides were skimming off the cream of the eligible men, or the brides were just looking for ways to get out of their war-torn homeland. There were several Citizenship Acts passed between 1946 and 1952. The Alien Fiancé Act of 1946 extended the privileges to Filipino and Asian Indian fiancés of war veterans. A 1947 amendment made it possible for Korean and Japanese wives and fiancés of US soldiers to immigrate. Repeal of the Oriental Exclusion Act in 1952 eased the way for Asian brides. Over 51,000 were Filipinos and about 50,000 were Japanese. There were thousands of GIs in Japan during the post-war occupation and many marriages. The American Red Cross Bride School taught cooking, baby care, etiquette, and emphasized gender roles to the new wives. Seattle had a Japanese war bride couples club. 22 couples out of a possible 95 joined. The brides had left everything behind, and the task of the club was to help them fit in. There were support groups and naturalization classes to help the brides study for their citizenship papers. They needed a working knowledge of English and to know the presidents of the United States in order, the capitals of the states. They had to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and be able to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. The groups helped them learn American customs and become citizens and make social contacts. In 1946, the Immigration and Naturalization Service office in Seattle worked in schools and social service agencies to make classes available to prepare the war brides to become naturalized. This newspaper article shows Mrs. Lawrence Powers of Seattle helping 2 students. There was a 20-week naturalization class in West Seattle for a fee of $2. National Travelers Aid Society and Community Chest helped with translators. Seattle had a Belgium American club for war brides from Belgium. Most of the support groups only lasted a couple of years, but they were very helpful to the brides. There were many newspaper articles and photos. This article and photo is of a tea given for the Seattle Overseas Wives Club by the English-speaking union. Readers liked to see and hear how the war brides were adjusting. It was romantic and exciting. There were lots of cultural differences. Although the brides were initially treated with suspicion, it usually gave way to curiosity. There were many shortages in rationing during the war. Parachutes were made from white nylon or silk. In the US, when a parachute was being assembled and rejected for some reason, sometimes the material was used for wedding gowns. In war zones, supplies were usually extremely restricted. If a parachute was found in a field, it was used for underwear, nightgowns, blouses, shirts, and wedding gowns, or whatever was needed. This gown is in the Hutchinson Museum database on the fold3.com. In 1965, Parade, the American Council for National Service, the Italian Welfare Council, and Cosmopolitan Associates sent questionnaires and did follow-up interviews with war brides all over the United States. This is a breakdown by country of the war brides that responded to the poll. This is a summary of what the bride said 20 years after coming to the US as a war bride. 9 out of 10 said they were happy. Their marriage was successful and they would marry the same man again. Most were fond of the US and considered themselves as American, but they missed their relatives and homeland. More than half said they and their husbands had problems adjusting in the United States. Many said they were considered foreign by their in-laws and local community. Their children were fully Americanized and sometimes looked down on their mothers. Nearly half said they had been disappointed in America in some ways. But some said, being so far away from home, the brides and their husbands were forced to work out their problems, which could make for a strong marriage. The survey was not completely accurate. It does not tell you the percentage of women who completed the survey, and it's only a small portion of the war brides. The most disastrous marriages had probably collapsed long before the survey was taken. Some said that although their marriage was functioning, it might not be called successful. Women who spoke English adjusted more easily. Some women faced hostility, financial insecurity, loneliness, in-law problems, and the realization that they were the ones that needed to adjust, not their husbands. The marriages may have worked out so well because of all the red tape the couples had to go through to marry a foreign national. It was hard to get permission. Even though most were young, they were usually mature and probably from dealing with the war. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Trish. That was wonderful. If you would stop your screen share. All right. Last but not least, we have Joan Burton giving her presentation. And just a reminder, folks, feel free to post any questions that you have for the panelists in the chat, and we'll ask those during Q&A.
All right, my topic is the women who saved a forest. About a century ago, a group of courageous and feisty women in Western Washington resolved to buy an ancient forest to save its majestic trees from being logged. A few problems lay in their way. Federation State Forest near Mount Rainier began as a project planned by women who were untrained in the engineering and the technology required to design it, and the managerial effort needed to see it to fruition. They didn't know how to succeed, much less whether they could, but they had a vision of giving a forest and a park to the people of the state of Washington. So they started to work on the steps they needed to take. They began their quest in the mid-1920s and completed the task in 1949, the year before the middle of the 20th century. Many original members lived long enough to see their goal achieved. The story starts with an Everett, Washington high school teacher, Jean Caithness, who was the daughter of a lumberman and a book club enthusiast. Her family had left Wisconsin after most of the big coniferous trees there were toppled. She later recalled her shock after revisiting her former home, where she found all the great monarchs of the forest completely gone. That memory preyed upon her, and she foresaw a similar fate coming for the giant conifers of the Pacific Northwest. In a speech called "The Message of the Fir," delivered at a timber preservation meeting in the mid-1920s in her new hometown of Everett, Jean speculated, is the future to hold no forests, no silent places? Where will your children and your children's children seek surcease and respite from care? Writing the message from a Douglas fir's viewpoint, she pronounced, "It has taken nature many hundreds of years to make me what I am. Man can destroy me in a day. Are not a few of us to remain?" Timber was men's business a century ago, so she undertook to convince men of the necessity of conserving the state's major resource. Her male audience listened politely, but without enthusiasm, for was not timber a crop? Why should we save any of them, the lumber company executives contended. Discouraged, Jean began an intensive effort to interest local women leaders in her plan. She started by asking to speak at the annual convention of the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs. Members of this organization already felt strongly about saving the vanishing forests of Western Washington. The General Federation of Women's Club was founded in 1890. Across the nation, it grew to consist of 3,000 federated women's clubs, which promoted civic improvements through volunteer service. Unity in diversity became its motto. State federations began to evolve in 1892. They attracted women who could express their opinions on issues and causes even before they had the right to vote. During this period, the progressive movement supported a range of causes such as pure food and drug administration, public health care for mothers and children, a ban on child labor, support for public schools, libraries, and parks, public sanitation, protection of children, and help for Indians. Women took them all on, and in Washington State, members of the State Federation of Women's Clubs also became aware of the loss of magnificent old-growth forests in the environment around them. Inspired by Jean, the Federation's president, Esther Stark Maltby, urged other members to rally around a mission to save a portion of the Douglas firs, western red cedars, western hemlock, and Sitka spruce trees in surrounding forests. They appointed Jean Caithness as the group's forestry chair, in charge of fundraising efforts to buy enough forest land for a park. She became affectionately known as the Tree Lady. Launched in 1926, the plan was to secure a large stand of trees to give to the state of Washington in trust of the Parks Commission, at that time composed of the Secretary of State, State Treasurer, and Commissioner of Public Lands. The women divided up the state in proportion to membership in geographic areas and members' ability to pay. All across the state, Federation members gave donations and raised funds. Times were hard, and raising sufficient funds took them 2 years. They sold Save a Tree buttons, stamps, and $100 bronze plaques, which buyers could attach to the tree trunks of their choice. One man understood their crusade. He was Stephen P. Mather of Chicago. You'll find tributes to him on large bronze tablets attached to rocks in many national parks in the country. While traveling in the West, he visited Seattle, where he caught Jean Caithness's contagious enthusiasm. His $500 donation, an impressive gift for the time, went into a fund for supplies and publicity for the forest project. At the same time, Dean Hugo Winkenwerder of the University of Washington School of Forestry agreed to advise the women in selecting an appropriate tract of land to be preserved. In the midst of this excitement, Jean Caithness married Thomas Greenlees and moved to his home city of Seattle. It took more than 2 years for the women to raise enough money to buy 62 acres of enormous old-growth trees on the western slope of Snoqualmie Pass. The purchase price of the Federation forest was $25,000. The check went to Snoqualmie Lumber Company, a subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser. The manager, George Long, admitted at a presentation ceremony that the option would never have been granted if the company executives had thought the women could actually raise the money. The name Federation Forest comes from a statewide organization, also called the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Its official dedication was delayed until a highway was completed through the magnificent tract, so it took place in Olympia in 1934. Tree Lady Jean Caithness Greenlees died of pneumonia in December of that year. She had once proclaimed that the forest group's motto could be the lay of the stout-hearted tree savers, or perhaps relentless fate versus undaunted determination. Almost immediately after the tract was purchased, however, bad luck began to threaten the Federation forest. In hot September weather, timber cutting along the border of the tract started fires along Joy Creek, charring some of the biggest specimens. Widening the highway also took a toll of the big trees. A bad windstorm killed a traveler, so the highway department topped some of the forest's most spectacular trees. A selective logging experiment to the east brought about an inadvertent trespassing incident, which sacrificed another 22 of the mightiest giants, averaging over 1,000 years old. In 1938, another storm blew down 19 more trees. and the Parks Department was ordered to cut back all trees within 200 feet of the highway. With that, the Parks Commission advised the Federation to sell back to the lumber company, the Federation Parkland, for the $25,000 to be done as agreed to in the original deed in case of disaster. The legislature passed a bill to put that same amount into a fund to buy a new tract of land. Disappointed and dismayed as they were, the Women Federation officials vowed to proceed with a new tract of trees, this time with 800 new young trees growing on land adjoining the White River. The women were not going to allow their vision to die. The land they bought for the new federated forest lies just west of Enumclaw on Highway 410 on the White River. The chairman of the State Parks Commission and Governor Arthur Langley addressed the second dedication in 1949. Esther Maltby spoke to those present on why save a forest. In recognition of her work to save the Federation forest, the board of the Washington State Federation of Women's Clubs voted to honor President Maltby with a trail in her name in the grove. Next to a demonstration plot near the river, the name of Tree Lady Jean Caithness Greenlease is also carved into a directional sign by the roadside. The club women of the Northwest intended that the forest be their permanent gift to the citizens of the area. To this day, hikers and picnickers enjoy more than 12 miles of trails, winding among native plants and diverse trees that through the years have grown mature and stately, much like those they originally envisioned they would save. In 1952, a grove of trees was dedicated in the Federation Forest as Ella Higginson Grove on land donated by her closest friend, Catherine Montgomery. Ella Higginson was the first poet laureate of Washington State. Much of her poetry dealt with the theme of greed, eroding and destroying beauty. In an essay she wrote titled The New West, she declared, "I hate this many-headed thing called civilization that is taking away from us Westerners the things we love." An example of Higginson's poetry portraying the beauty of the natural world is The Snow Pearls, published in 1897. These are the very first examples of poetry using the local natural world symbols as imagery. The snow pearls in this poem are the glaciated volcanoes around Puget Sound. I love the pale green emerald, the ruby's drop of flame, the rare and precious sardonyx of deeply ended fame. I love the opal's restless fire with green lights interwove, and even the royal amethyst. But most of all, I love the string of snow pearls set around this great blue sapphire, Puget Sound. Many more verses follow describing the icy volcanoes around Puget Sound, Mounts Rainier, Baker, and Glacier, as though they are pearls. Ella Higginson was also a member of the Federation of Women's Clubs and promoted women's rights throughout her life. Although her fiction seems dated today and her plots are melodramatic, she is credited with inventing Pacific Northwest literature. In 1931, the Washington Federation of Women's Clubs named her the first poet laureate of the state of Washington. Now I want to tell you about one more member of the Federation who was the mother of the Pacific Crest Trail. Stretching from northern Washington to southern California, the Pacific Crest Trail sweeps across summits, undulates around glacial lakes, and dips into valleys in some of North America's most majestic scenery. This trail was conceived in the mind of a Washington woman hiker almost a century ago. She didn't set out with this goal. She did connect several thoughts to come up with the concept. She did have to spend a lot of energy promoting her idea, and she was fortunate enough to live long enough to see her vision realized. Tens of thousands of hikers, backcountry skiers, and snowshoers enjoy parts of all of the trail every year. It's become a legend, a quest, and a place to enjoy the spectacular scenery of the far western mountains. Catherine Montgomery loved mountains, any mountains. Wherever she was, she looked for trails and the foothills they could take her to. She called it tramping. She enjoyed tramping on trails around her new home. A founding member of the Teachers College that would become Western Washington University, she had come all the way across the United States from Prince Edward Island, north of Maine, to Bellingham, Washington, to serve as a founding professor of education. Mountains surrounded her, and she was delighted to be able to begin to explore the North and Central Cascades. A bonus was the sight of actual volcanoes that she could see on the skyline. Catherine and her best friend, Ida Baker, another professor, spent their weekends and summers together wandering amidst the beautiful mountains of the North Cascades. Sometimes they went backpacking to remote areas. There were no maps or guidebooks, so they found their way by themselves. They wore ankle-length bloomers because that was what women hikers wore in the wilderness in those days. In 1924, she discovered an article in a national monthly magazine, American Forestry, titled "The Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia by Foot Trail, a little hike of 2,000 miles along the skyline of the Appalachian Ranges." Catherine read it avidly and was fascinated. Hikers had devised and built a trail that took them from the northern tip of New England all the way to the deep south of Georgia. That knowledge rapidly led to her brainstorm. The mountains that she and Ida had explored were part of a natural divide, just like the Appalachian peaks and ridges. Hikers here could follow the crest of the Western Mountains just as they did back east. Why not design a new trail from Mexico to Canada? Puzzled about how to proceed, she told nobody about her idea. Ida Baker had died several years earlier. The concept of a continent-spanning trail continued to germinate in her mind. One morning, nearly 2 years later, Catherine was listening to a member of the Seattle Mountaineers Club named Joseph Hazard, trying to convince her to buy his textbooks for the college. He had also traveled to Bellingham to speak that night to the Mount Baker Club, the local mountaineering club. Suddenly she interrupted him. "You know what I was thinking about as we sat here, Mr. Hazard? I was hoping you were considering buying my books, Miss Montgomery." "Oh, that, of course I will. I consider them the best. I still do. But why don't you mountaineers do something big for Western America?" "Just what do you have in mind, Miss Montgomery?" "A long winding trail along the crest of the mountains with mile markers and shelter huts from Mexico to Canada, like the Appalachian Trail in this magazine. I have been reading about that trail on the East Coast. We should have one here like it running down the West Coast." Joseph Hazard was speechless as he looked at the magazine story she handed him and smiled. He knew a great idea when he saw one. Joseph Hazard took that idea and the magazine with its pictures to his lecture at the Bellingham Mountaineers that very night. Everyone there liked the idea and decided to help work toward making it a reality. Catherine Montgomery was delighted. Though she kept her academic job, she often joined promoters to help plan for the trail and its construction. She and her colleagues lobbied hard for the funds to make it happen. Mountaineers members in Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia also agreed and banded together. They organized to raise money to buy the land and clear it for a long, winding trail along the crest of the coastal mountains. Completing the entire trail took many years, but adventuring athletes soon began to hike along the half-finished trail. After it was completed and as the years went by, the trail became enormously popular and beloved by long-distance through hikers. Today's hikers try to cover it all in one season, starting in Mexico in early spring and reaching Canada in October, just as the winter snows begin. Catherine Montgomery probably never did get to hike the trail, but she contributed money to build it and was an influential supporter of the effort. Catherine Montgomery lived to be 90, long enough to know that the Pacific Crest Trail, as she had envisioned it, had become a reality. She was aware that it was a valued treasure. She probably realized also that hikers competed to be the fastest ones along the trail. She had saved enough money on her professor's salary to build a nature interpretive center at Federation Forest. but her part in the creation of the Pacific Crest Trail had been forgotten by many. In 2010, she was inducted into the Western Washington University Women's Hall of Fame, which corrected that error. At that gathering, Catherine Montgomery was named the mother of the Pacific Crest Trail, and that's how we remember her today. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. This was all very fascinating, and I'm sure folks have questions. Feel free to pop questions in the chat, and I've compiled a few that have been asked throughout the course of this morning. The first question that we received in the chat was for Kate. An attendee asked, do you know how active women in general, besides the leaders of the movement, were involved in suffrage over this period of time?
Yeah, so in like women's suffrage lectures in 1882 and 1883, there's large crowds, both of men and women. There were a lot of male suffragists that need to be remembered as well. But there's also the hundreds of women who turned out to vote once they could in 1884 and 1885, which I mentioned briefly. But they also, in addition to being like a lot of women who voted, they also were a pretty significant voting bloc, and they did kind of change the government structure in Seattle, more from like the Republican Party towards the Democratic Party, which was controversial for a lot of reasons. But in addition to all these women who were voting, there were women who were against women's suffrage throughout this whole period. Later on in like the 1910s, there's the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which is founded by and run by women. So it's kind of a controversial opinion within the women's world at that time. So I guess to answer the question, there's a lot of women involved. There's a lot of women who vote, but there's also women who don't want anything to do with voting and politics. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Kate. I actually had a follow-up question that I was thinking about from a labor history perspective. In your research, did you come across information about working class women, women who were involved in unions, being involved in the suffrage movement? Because I feel like we know a lot about the middle and upper class women, but who were the working class women that were involved?
Yeah, so I think there's a quote that I referenced in my presentation where it's like the Seattle Post-Intelligencer was like, women from the coarser class are voting instead of like good and moral women. So yes, it seems that there were women of all classes voting, and people had a problem with it not just being upper class women voting. And there were, of course, women involved in labor movements out here at the time. So there's not a ton of source material on that particular instance, but those kind of quotes from newspaper articles indicate that women of all classes were voting, even though people didn't always like that.
Great, thank you. So the next question is for Trish, and you answered it briefly in the chat, but I was wondering if you could elaborate. Someone asked about, were there any war grooms? You mentioned that there were a few, and I'm curious who were the women that they married, and were these women primarily nurses? If you could speak more to that.
Okay, if a lot of US soldiers married British nurses, but you know, there could be a male nurse. There was I found a Danish man from Seattle who was working for the US War Department in Germany, and he married a former Coastal Guard SPAR, and that stands for United States Coast Guard Women's Reserve. And so there are lots of situations like that, not lots, but a few, and it did happen. And for a humorous look at that, you can see the I Was a Male War Bride movie with Cary Grant and Ann Sheridan. It's kind of a silly movie, but it shows what happened.
Interesting. That's a great question.
I hope that answers, but there were a few. It would be interesting to find out more.
All right. So this question is for Joan. I was curious, did these women involved in the conservation efforts, did they work with local indigenous tribes at all? Was there any indication in your resources about that?
See that they did. There wasn't any way to be in contact, and I don't think it occurred to them, frankly, that they needed to. I'm sorry to say that, but there wasn't much awareness of the native tribes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, any other questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've got a few in my back pocket. I have a question for all three of you. As an archivist, I'm always curious where your resources came from. And could each of you speak to the primary sources that you used in your research? What were the challenges that you found in finding relevant materials to your topic?
I'm happy to cover that one first. The letters that I reference are actually from UW Special Collections. You can find them. The letters from businessmen to Eugene Semple, who they don't want suffrage to be reenacted in the territory. The newspapers that I reference can be found online, the Library of Congress's website with the Chronicling America project. And then a lot of suffragists actually wrote memoirs. It was really popular to keep a journal, write down what's happening with you. So Abigail Scott Dunaway has an autobiography called Path Breaking. And then the suffrage movement as a whole was documented pretty well by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in their comprehensive multi-volume history of women's suffrage. So the biggest problem with those autobiographical sources is bias on the part of the people who write it, just because if you're a suffragist writing, you're going to have a particular point of view. But I actually didn't feel like there was a lack of sources on this topic. It's just if you can search hard enough to find them.
Well, I found many sources. And I had a nice summary, but I can't find it, of course. But the National Archives, the other archives from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they have fantastic collections on war brides. There's many newspaper articles and books. I found special, not as much on World War I, but on World War II, there are articles and special groups for specific nationalities like Japanese. They have their own. And there's just a lot of stuff out there. Just, I guess, Google it. The hard part, I thought, was trying to find the pictures that would go with the certain things that I specifically wanted. And I couldn't always find those.
Yeah, I've run into similar challenges doing exhibit curation. Sometimes the photos are out there, they haven't been collected and saved, or maybe they just don't exist anymore. Or
I found one and then had to leave, and somehow it went away and I could never get back to it.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Joan? What did you use for your
website for the Federated Women's Clubs on the internet was the best thing that I had. But what I found was it coincided that this whole movement to save the forest was a part of a larger progressive movement. And there were other women's groups, such as the League of Women Voters and the Women's Century Club and Women's University Club, all that came into being about the same time. And women were very idealistic about making a difference in the environment around them. And a person who's still a member of the Women's Century Club is Carla Rickerson, our former president. And I got a chance to talk to her, and she had me look up the Women's Century Club. And they have been in existence for over 100 years and have fought for many of these causes, not just conservation of the national forest, but many others as well. So it's interesting to see how idealistic women's clubs were and the missions that they stated as their ideal purposes.
Thanks, Kate, Trish, and Joan. We have a question in the chat for all three of you. How has COVID affected your ability to do research?
I stay at home and use my internet.
Yeah, very same for me. Most of the research for this presentation was done before COVID, so it hasn't super affected the research on this topic. But yeah, I think everyone is more reliant on internet resources. The newspapers that I reference are available online, so like, there are a lot of resources online for doing research.
The same for me. And there were a lot of books, things that maybe collections that I would have liked to have looked at in person, but couldn't. So, but it sure helps to have the internet. And so a lot of things are online. And you can still interview people on the phone. So that helps.
Yeah, that's good to hear. You know, we're all limited by what has been digitized and is made digitally available. And it's good that your topics that there's a lot out there for you to pull from already. I know from an archivist perspective and doing reference that there are folks whose topics really rely on those physical materials that are digitally accessible. And so really hoping that we're going to see all the archives start to open up in the next year. I'm excited for that. Trish, I had a question for you about the war brides who moved to the US. And did most of these women, or do you have any information about these women, did they enter the workforce, or were they primarily doing the unpaid labor of caretaking in the home? If they were in the workforce, do you have some information about the kinds of jobs that they were doing?
I didn't really research that, but I kind of have a feeling that from the articles that I did see that most of them were working on the home front. It was hard because so many people were taking the place of men when they were overseas, and then they lost their jobs. So they really weren't looking for extra women anywhere. And those were the times that's what you did, you stayed home.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we've got another question in the chat. For all three of you, where will your next research related to these topics take you? What is still on your mind to do?
I would say I'm interested in the interconnections between women's suffrage movements and other reform progressive movements of the 19th century. There's a lot of overlap between like anti-slavery movements, temperance, as I've mentioned, just a lot of different movements happening at the same time. And a lot of that actually happens in like the same areas, like upstate New York is very famous for that sort of thing. So that's one thing I'm interested in, is those interconnections between these movements.
I've been putting together a manuscript about women in the mountains, and I'm still working on it. I have women who are conservationists, like the Federation Forest Ladies, but also women who were climbers, and women who wrote guidebooks, and women who served on lookouts. And I find there's a lot of interest in women and their part in mountaineering. So that's what I'm working on.
I'm not specifically working on expanding this, but it was a fun subject to research, and there's just so much more information out there that I couldn't include the things like the war grooms and just little stories like that, tons of them.
Great, thank you. Got another question in the chat for Kate. Are you aware or interested in Equal Rights Amendment, and especially that work that women did in Utah, turning the Mormon missionary concept back with ERA missionaries?
I'm not super familiar with suffrage movements, like state-specific suffrage movements outside of Washington. And I'm also not as up to date as I should be on like 20th century women's rights and women's suffrage battles. So this is something I'm definitely interested in, is that more like holistic story of women's suffrage and how that turns into a more general women's rights movement. throughout the 19th and 20th century, but I'm not super familiar with it at this point.
Great, thanks, Kate. This is kind of related to the previous question about research that you have potentially for the future. Kind of thinking on the flip side, could you each tell us how you got into your research topic and kind of that strike of inspiration that motivated you to begin?
Sure, I'm happy to start off. I came across this topic when I was starting my undergraduate research thesis many years ago, and I was looking at women's suffrage in different states. And if you look at, I think it might be on Wikipedia, it says like Washington State 1910 parentheses 1883 for when women got the vote. I was like, what is that about? So that really started that. Sorry, my cat just jumped on my table. That really started that research journey. But I also, having lived here for a long time, I had no idea about this whole story. And that was something that was really fascinating to me as a Washington resident. So that's where it came from.
Well, many years ago when before the new MOHI was opening, I was one of the volunteers that was doing stories for the walls of the MOHI. And so we were told to pick like 5 or 6 projects, and then the committee looked at them and decided what they wanted. Well, one of the ones I had was the war brides, but it wasn't chosen. So I worked on a different one. And I always had this in my drawer, my research, fun research. And so this was a good time to pull it out and bring it together.
And I used to go hiking down on the White River and stop at Federation Forest. So I'd never looked into the history of it before. And here was all this wonderful background information on the signs and on the handouts, and I could look it up. And I had a lot more appreciation for the women having to fight through the Depression to raise the money for that purchase, and then being told that they had to find another one because the land was being logged inadvertently. I also want to say on the subject of women's rights that there was actually women who carried signs for the 1909 AYP to the summit of Mount Rainier that said votes for women. So we can think of these mountaineers campaigning in their own way with a flag on the summit of Mount Rainier.
Neat.
That's awesome. I feel like maybe I've seen a photograph of that somewhere, but do you know, Joan, if there are images of that?
Well, I think there are, but I haven't one of my own. I wish I had, but I don't.
I think there might be one at the National Archives. I think I've seen it there.
Cool, I'll have to do a little bit of digging afterwards. So we've got 5 more minutes. If anybody else has questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. We've got time. Or if any of the panelists have questions for each other too, I welcome that. Looks like we've got a question. Any recommendations for further reading on these subjects?
My favorite book was the one I mentioned in the presentation, was War Brides of World War II, and this one. But there, I don't know, there were just so many books. It's hard to narrow it down. A lot of thesis work on it too that I came across.
On my part, there's a lot of, I mean, you can read those autobiographical sources I mentioned, like Abigail Scott Dunaway's autobiography. There's also biographies of her specifically. But there's also a lot of just general research on why Western United States got the vote for women first. You can find, there's a lot more sources on that particular phenomenon. So that's what I would recommend for further research.
A later conservationist was Dyer. And I've been reading about her life and all the contributions that Polly made in so many ways, but she foremost was a conservationist who wanted to save the Olympic forest. And then she helped to design and campaign for the North Cascades National Park. And whenever there was a battle of some kind, there was Polly fighting right till the very end of her life. And she wanted to expand the boundaries of that park. And that was the last thing that she was working for before she died. So the conservationist movement has many people who have worked hard for it over the years.
Thank you, everyone. So we just have a couple of minutes left. And so I think I'm going to take this time to pop the link to the keynote in the chat before we switch gears here. So I want to thank Kate, Trish, and Joan for your amazing presentations. This was really interesting and such a worthwhile way to spend a Saturday morning. And I know I want to dig into all of these resources. And it's just really exciting to see, just hear these stories of these intrepid women making big change. So really glad that you shared your presentations with us today. Just finding the link here, popping that in the chat. And then I'll also share my screen with a slide that, so you can just cut and paste this link into your browser, and that will take you to the Zoom room for the next presentation. So I'm going to share my screen really quick here. This also has the link, and the keynote starts at 11:30, so you've got a little bit of a break, and then we'll hear from Knut Berger on his presentation, which should be relevant and fascinating. So thanks all for attending, and really looking forward to hearing the other presentations today.